little bit because Maury McGaw, the Region 5 regional director, was supposed to do this, and I found out last week that he couldn't come because of a regional directors meeting and that it was me, and I asked him if he had a PowerPoint, and of course the answer was no. So this is what I was able to pull together. And in thinking about the complementary relationship, or is there a complementary relationship, I was thinking chicken and egg, or carrot and stick, and I don't know, so we'll see. So hopefully my thoughts came together. We'll see. So racial segregation, like all other forms of cruelty and tyranny, debases all human beings, those who are its victims, those who victimize, and in quite subtle ways, those who are mere accessories. This is a quote from Kenneth B. Clark. Kenneth Clark and his wife, Mamie, were psychologists, and they're the ones who conducted the very famous doll test. And it's the doll test that was part of the expert testimony in Brown v. Board of Education. So we'll just start with that. This is Lorraine Hansberry. The picture on the left is the picture. The picture on the right is a mural that one day I was walking home from the L and I happened to look up. And wow, there's a mural of Lorraine Hansberry down the street from my house. How cool is that? And for me, it is super cool because A Raisin in the Sun is my favorite play. I read it in high school. So around the room, everybody knows about A Raisin in the Sun. Raise your hands. Just about everybody. All right. So then, because we're all fair housing geeks, does everybody know about the case? Her father's case. Hansberry v. Lee. Hands. See, fewer hands. So I was thinking about that because, and it led me to the power of storytelling. So then, for those of us who know both A Raisin in the Sun and the case, Hansberry v. Lee, the connection between that enforcement action and that Supreme Court case and that story is pretty clear. But when I was talking to, because unbelievably, we have 4 new employees in the Office of Fair Housing in Chicago, and I asked them, everybody knew the play, A Raisin in the Sun. No one knew about the case except for the young woman who was a graduate of Howard Law School. So then my next question is always, how many of you realize that this was a story of fair housing? How many people made that connection when you read it in high school or college or when you saw a production of it? Raise your hands. So see, just a few. We've got to do a better job of making these connections because A Raisin in the Sun is a powerful, powerful play. It is read. It's written, I think, 1959. So, and here we are in 2015. Just last year, it was a Broadway production with Denzel Washington, of all people. So we've got to make these connections. So this is from one of the plays. But here's a little bit about the case. So Lorraine Hansberry's father purchased a home in the Woodlawn neighborhood in defiance of a racially restrictive covenant. Lee filed suit to evict the Hansberrys. That eviction was upheld in the Circuit Court, the Illinois Supreme Court, the Illinois Supreme Court, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And it didn't rule that the racially restrictive covenants were invalid, but actually it couldn't be enforced because only 54% of the neighborhood had signed the petition as opposed to 94%, 95%. This is the headline from the Chicago Defender, November 16, 1940, that the Hansberry decision opens 500 new homes to race. So interesting in this time when we're talking about affirmatively furthering fair housing. But then here's the story of a neighborhood, and the Woodlawn neighborhood, and the house. So this is the house, 6140 South Rhodes. So Woodlawn sits about 8 miles south of downtown Chicago. It is literally 2 blocks south of the University of Chicago, and it is easily accessible by the lake. In 1940, the Woodlawn neighborhood was a predominantly upper middle class white neighborhood. By 1960, 90% African American, and in 2015, still 90% African American. And 2011, the Woodlawn neighborhood received a Choice Neighborhoods grant of $30 million, and they have revitalized the public housing in there, Grove Park. So Grove Park was going to be torn down, as with many of the public housing in Chicago in the plan for transformation. Grove Park was going to be torn down, and those public housing residents were going to receive vouchers. But now that we're about 15, 16 years into the plan for transformation in the city of Chicago, they knew with those vouchers that there was going to be very little choice of where they were going to end up, and that the likelihood was that they were not going to end up in better neighborhoods with better schools, with access to grocery stores, to better jobs, and so they fought to stay. And they were successful. So now, they're there. So welcome to Woodlawn. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the high school, the public high school that those kids can go to. The high school that Woodlawn students go to is Hyde Park Academy. Average ACT score is 15. The African American population of Woodlawn, or of Hyde Park Academy, is 99% black, 0% white, 0.5% Hispanic, 0.6% multiracial. All right. So then when we're thinking about choice and access and affordable housing, let's compare Woodlawn to Winnetka. So, and see, we've got Marilyn who's in here. We've got some people from Open Communities. So Winnetka is a suburb, north suburb of Chicago. But you might know it because it's got the best high school in Illinois, New Trier High School. So Winnetka, the median income is over $200,000. The median house costs $849,000. The demographics of Winnetka, 89.1% white, 4% Asian, 2.9% Hispanic, 2.7% multiracial, 0.2% black in Winnetka. So then the high school, the demographics of the high school, where the average ACT is 27, educates 3,000 students. Only 3.5% of those students are low income. The population is 83.6 white, 0.8% black, 4.3% Hispanic, 8% Asian, and 3% multiracial. As fair housing practitioners, this is a neighborhood that would be described as a neighborhood of opportunity, right? But when I looked to see what the rents would be in Winnetka, a 1-bedroom, 1-bathroom, $1,250. So I looked, the next lowest rent I could find for a 3-bedroom was $3,000. I decided not to depress myself and look at the zoning laws for a suburb in Winnetka, because I can imagine that there are some exclusionary zoning that makes sure that there's no multifamily housing built, let alone affordable multifamily housing. We're not even talking about public housing, but affordable housing. I decided I didn't want to be depressed. Didn't want to be depressed. So these are some of the things, some of the stats that we're up against. So then some of the tools when we're talking about fair housing enforcement. Title VIII of the Fair Housing Act with affirmatively furthering fair housing. Let's see, hold on. Oh, here we go. Okay. I'm just ahead of myself. So we've got Title VIII of the Fair Housing Act, with the inclusion of affirmatively furthering fair housing, 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and in 2012, HUD issued LGBT equal access to HUD programs. But there are some limits to fair housing enforcement. We are reliant upon the private efforts of individual victims of discrimination. So, in that limitation, it just further illustrates how important it is for education and outreach. So, in this room, very few people knew that A Raisin in the Sun was a fair housing story. So, we do this. So if we don't know this, the public for sure doesn't know this. But the connection is, what a powerful story. And as people who enforce the Fair Housing Act, or educate people on enforcing the Fair Housing Act, we've got to harness the power of these stories. Because I can put up all of the graphs, all of the maps, all of the data to show why integration is important and why we are still segregated. But I don't know that those maps and that data is convincing those of us who are not already convinced of the importance of fair housing and choice. So we need to harness the power of these stories in education and outreach and enforcement. But we've got some high points. High points of this year: Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs versus Inclusive Communities, the Supreme Court opinion, where they ruled that disparate impact is cognizable under the Fair Housing Act. I don't know how many of you were not hopeful. I was not particularly hopeful, so I was incredibly surprised and ecstatic that it was not destroyed. Then we also have HUD's affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, which this might be the first time I'm standing up in front of a group of people going, well, it might be coming. We'll see if it's coming. I don't know when it's coming. It might come. So we have it. But again, affirmatively furthering fair housing is a tough sell. This is a quote from Representative Paul Gosar. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right, a Republican out of Arizona. And this is what he said about AFFH. American citizens and communities should be free to choose where they would like to live and not be subject to federal neighborhood engineering at the behest of an overreaching federal government. So I think that was a long way of him saying that he does not believe that HUD should be social engineering its neighborhoods. Well, the response to that is that clearly HUD has been in the business of socially engineering neighborhoods. So has the federal government. This is probably not that popular for some people, but the suburbs were socially engineered. They were built with federal funds, and the access to those suburbs was the interstate, which was, again, built with federal funds. So if that's not social engineering and the use of federal monies to engineer neighborhoods. I don't know what is. So doesn't HUD, doesn't the federal government, don't we all have an obligation to correct some of these injustices? Clearly, I believe so. So, the AFFH final rule includes a requirement for certain HUD grantees, PHAs, and CPD block grant consolidated planning agencies to conduct an assessment of fair housing planning process. This planning process is supposed to help communities analyze challenges to fair housing choice and establish their own goals and priorities to address the fair housing barriers in their community. So this community participation piece, where the rule links existing community participation and consultation requirements to the AFH process, to ensure program participants give the public opportunities for involvement in the development of the AFH and in its incorporation into the consolidated plan and or the PHA plan. This is pretty huge. So this is where education and outreach comes into play. We've got to reach out to the communities because there will be no community participation if they don't know. They don't know what fair housing is. They're not going to lend their voices. This is a chance for the people in the community to have input into how their communities will look 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the line. It's an opportunity. I think that we need to seize on this and, yes, both better enforce the Fair Housing Act, but also educate and reach out and do some grassroots organizing, build coalitions, collaborate, maybe with people we haven't collaborated before with in the past. But this is a chance. But part of it is because we know what happens when people don't know and those voices aren't heard. We have instances, I think it's Cincinnati just a few years ago, I'm looking at Rennell, where the swimming pool and the landlord at the apartment complex put a whites-only sign in the apartment complex's swimming pool because I guess there were products in her hair that was making the water cloudy. So this is from 2012, not from 1960, not from 1940. These are instances, and I'm looking around the room, I see a lot of you all, I get your cases, we work on cases together. These things are not the past. They are the present. And we have got to do a better job of telling these stories. And it's because there's power in storytelling. Well-constructed stories serve a multitude of functions. They inspire, convince, motivate, mentor, entertain, and educate. These stories serve many purposes. They clarify and show meaning. They can bridge cultural gaps, help identify with a particular audience, persuade the audience, inspire people to act, and build a shared vision. And that's our call. We have to do it. Thank you.